Imagine paying more for a stick of bark than for a bar of gold. In ancient Rome, that wasn't an exaggeration. It was the price list. For over 1,000 years, kings went to war for it. Empires rose and fell chasing it. Entire fortunes were built and destroyed over a spice most of us don't even think twice about today. Armies marched for it. Fleets sank for it. Treaties were signed and broken because of it. Right now, There's probably a jar of it sitting in your kitchen. Dusty, forgotten, pushed to the back of the cabinet behind things you actually use. Worth maybe $2 or $3 at the grocery store. But it wasn't always this way. For most of human history, this single spice was worth more than almost anything else on Earth. Harder to obtain than silver. More fought over than land itself. 3,000 years ago, Egyptian priests weighed this same spice against pure gold, ounce for ounce, to prepare pharaohs for the afterlife. It wasn't seasoning. It was sacred. It traveled across deserts on the backs of camels, guarded like treasure. Because in a very real sense, that's exactly what it was. By the 1600s, one single trading company controlled so much of it that they deliberately burned entire warehouses full of stock, just to keep the price in Europe from falling. Think about that. Destroying a fortune on purpose to protect an even bigger fortune, and anyone who tried to grow it, sell it, or trade it outside their control could pay with their life. Men died for it. Ships burned for it. Entire islands were conquered, occupied, and fought over for centuries, all because of this one plant. Sailors risked scurvy and shipwreck chasing rumors of where it grew. Kings funded entire voyages across unknown oceans, hoping to find the source and break someone else's monopoly before their rivals could get there first. And somewhere along the way, an elaborate false story, involving a giant mythical bird guarding cliffside nests, was invented and repeated for hundreds of years, just to keep the true source of this spice hidden from the rest of the world, protected by traders who had every reason to make sure that secret never got out. By the end of it all, one small island in the Indian Ocean would become the center of a global obsession, fought over relentlessly by 4 different empires across 300 years. This is the history of cinnamon, the spice that quietly started a war for the entire world. In the tombs of Egypt's pharaohs, cinnamon wasn't a kitchen spice. It was a sacred substance, carefully packed into the linen wrappings of the dead, believed to help preserve the body for its journey into eternity. Embalmers worked by torchlight, layering resin and bark with precision, because mistaken this ritual wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous for the soul itself, a risk no priest was willing to take. To reach Egypt at all, cinnamon had to travel an almost impossible distance. Camel caravans carried sealed clay jars across scorching desert sands, guarded closely on a journey that could take weeks, moving slowly toward the Nile from lands most Egyptians would never see with their own eyes. Many of the traders who made this long journey never once learned exactly where the spice originally grew, only which hands had passed it along the way. Inside the temples, priests burned cinnamon alongside myrrh in bronze censers, offering its rising smoke to the gods before towering statues of Osiris. The scent itself was considered holy, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, filling the temple halls with a fragrance ordinary Egyptians rarely ever experienced in their entire lives. Royal scribes recorded every single shipment on papyrus, in careful, deliberate handwriting, referring to it simply as the spice from the land of Punt, a distant and mysterious place that most people only knew through rumor, legend, and half-remembered stories passed down from sailors. At the busy docks along the Nile, Egyptian traders bartered gold, ivory, and fine linen for bark that had already traveled thousands of miles by both sea and sand, changing hands many times before it ever reached Egyptian soil, its true point of origin growing hazier with every single exchange. And deep within the private chambers of queens, that same precious bark was pressed and distilled into fragrant oil, poured carefully into alabaster vessels, a luxury reserved almost exclusively for royalty and the highest members of Egyptian society, worn as much as a symbol of status as a simple perfume. For the ancient Egyptians, cinnamon wasn't simply a flavor. It was tied directly to power, to religion, and to the very idea of what it meant to live forever. A single spice woven into nearly every layer of their civilization. from the humblest scribe to the most powerful pharaoh who ever ruled the Nile. In ancient Greece, physicians ground cinnamon bark by hand, mixing it into medicine believed to cure everything from poison to plague. It appeared in the writings of early Greek scholars, praised as one of the most powerful substances known to the ancient world, worth studying as carefully as any rare metal. Its true origin debated endlessly among the educated elite of the Greek world. But it was Rome that turned cinnamon into pure obsession. When Emperor Nero lost his wife Poppaea, grief-stricken and desperate to prove his devotion, he ordered an entire year's supply of the empire's cinnamon burned on her funeral pyre, a single act of mourning worth an almost unimaginable fortune, remembered by historians centuries later as one of the most extravagant displays of grief in Roman history. At lavish Roman banquets, slaves moved quietly between the tables, sprinkling ground cinnamon over roasted meat and spiced wine for guests wealthy enough to treat something so rare as a simple seasoning, a small gesture that few outside the Roman elite could ever afford to repeat even once in a lifetime. Surviving Roman trade ledgers show cinnamon valued at roughly 15 times the price of silver, ounce for ounce, a number so extreme that modern historians still find it difficult to fully comprehend, especially given how common the spice eventually became many centuries later. To reach Rome at all, merchant ships had to brave brutal storms across the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, cargo lashed tightly to the deck, knowing that one wrong wave, one broken hull, could sink an entire fortune to the bottom of the ocean floor, along with the crew who had risked everything to bring it home. And in the crowded marketplaces of the empire, ordinary Romans could only watch and wince as spice traders casually demanded prices that most working people would never come close to affording in their entire lives, cinnamon remaining firmly a luxury of emperors, senators, and the extraordinarily wealthy, a symbol as much of status as of flavor, displayed openly at feasts, precisely so that other guests would notice and take note. By the height of the Roman Empire, cinnamon had become so deeply tied to power and prestige that owning it said as much about a person's place in society as the size of their villa or the number of slaves in their household, a quiet but unmistakable marker of wealth that everyone at the table understood. For centuries, Arab traders controlled the flow of cinnamon into Europe, and they protected that monopoly with one of the most elaborate lies in the entire history of global trade, a story so convincing it survived for generation after generation. They told buyers that a giant, mythical bird, known as the cinnamologus, built its nest high on impossible cliffs, weaving together precious cinnamon sticks that no ordinary person could ever hope to reach or climb toward safely, no matter how determined they were. In reality, sealed sacks of cinnamon were quietly loaded onto wooden tow ships under cover of darkness, departing from hidden desert ports that most foreign merchants were never once permitted to see with their own eyes, let alone visit or explore for themselves. The myth even offered a clever solution for the desperate. Hunters were said to lure the giant bird's nest down by leaving heavy chunks of ox meat nearby, letting the overloaded nest collapse under its own weight, scattering cinnamon sticks onto the ground below for the taking, as if nature itself had provided the harvest. Caravans crossed vast stretches of open desert at dusk, closely guarded by armed escorts, the true source of the spice kept secret for one generation after another, passed down only to those the traders trusted completely, often within a single family line for decades at a time, and in dim, candlelit tents scattered across the Mediterranean world. Wealthy European buyers paid enormous sums in solid gold, again and again, never once learning where cinnamon actually grew, or how far it had truly traveled before finally reaching their outstretched hands. This single, carefully maintained myth held firm for well over 1,000 years. An extraordinary feat of secrecy that protected an entire trade network built almost entirely on controlled information, silence, and the simple fact that no European buyer ever thought to question a story repeated so consistently by so many different traders. By the time Europeans finally uncovered the truth, the Arab monopoly had already shaped centuries of trade, politics, and exploration across 3 separate continents, quietly influencing decisions made in royal courts that never even realized how deeply they had been misled. And the price of that ignorance was staggering. Entire fortunes spent, entire voyages launched, all in pursuit of a spice whose true origin had been hidden in plain sight the entire time. In medieval Europe, a lord's feast table wasn't truly complete without a locked spice chest, positioned close to the head seat, guarded as carefully as gold coins or family jewels, because in many practical ways, it was worth just as much, if not considerably more, when the Black Death swept across the continent, leaving entire villages empty and grief. Stricken, physicians mixed cinnamon into desperate remedies, hoping against hope that its powerful scent and rare properties might somehow hold back a disease that medicine of the time simply couldn't explain, treat, or control by any other known means. For a noblewoman preparing for marriage, a wedding dowry might include carefully wrapped bundles of cinnamon, bound tightly in silk, presented alongside jewelry and fine fabric as proof of a family's wealth, and standing within their community, a detail every guest would quietly notice and remember. In candlelit monasteries, monks copied medical and culinary recipes late into the night, casually noting in the margins that the cinnamon called for was, quite literally, worth more than the very parchment the recipe itself was written on. An almost unbelievable statement that was, at the time, entirely true. On Venice's crowded, chaotic docks, crates of spices were unloaded under heavy armed guard, while merchants shouted over one another, competing loudly and aggressively to strike the very best deal before their rivals could close the same transaction first. Fortunes rising and falling within a single afternoon, and just outside those docks, in the narrow streets beyond, ordinary villagers could only watch through frosted windows as carts loaded with spices rolled slowly past their homes, carrying a kind of wealth they knew they would never taste, smell, or hold in their own two hands. For centuries, cinnamon remained a quiet but constant marker of the enormous gap between Europe's wealthiest families and everyone else, struggling simply to survive, a small stick of bark separating one class from another, far more clearly than most people today could ever imagine. And yet, despite the danger, the expense, and the sheer distance it had to travel, demand for cinnamon across Europe never once slowed down, a hunger that would soon push entire kingdoms to search for a faster, cheaper way to reach its source directly, no matter the risk, the distance, or the unknown dangers waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. By the early 1400s, European kings had become obsessed with a single question that seemed impossible to answer. Where did cinnamon actually come from? And could it somehow be reached directly, without relying on Arab or Venetian middlemen along the way? In his private map room, the King of Portugal leaned over a half-finished chart, pointing toward an unknown eastern coastline circled roughly in red ink, based on nothing more than sailors' rumors and second-hand stories, passed along busy Mediterranean ports. Christopher Columbus stood on his ship's deck for hours at a time, scanning the empty horizon, secretly hoping that sailing west across an unmapped ocean might somehow lead him directly to the fabled Spice Islands everyone in Europe had heard so much about. Vasco da Gama's fleet rounded the storm, battered Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, sailors gripping tightly to the rigging in genuine fear, uncertain whether their ships would survive the violent seas long enough to reach anything at all. Royal cartographers back in Europe sketched imagined Spice Islands onto half-finished world maps, working almost entirely from rumor rather than verified fact, filling in blank spaces with guesses that occasionally turned out to be closer to the truth than anyone expected. Meanwhile, aboard those same cramped ships, ordinary sailors fell seriously ill with scurvy, weakened and desperate, driven onward only by the distant promise of the fortune waiting for them at the very end of the voyage, whenever and wherever that might finally be. And back home, European kings signed royal charters funding increasingly dangerous expeditions eastward, gambling entire fortunes on the simple bet that whoever found the source first would control Europe's spice trade for generations to come, reshaping the balance of power across the entire continent. This wasn't just about flavor or luxury anymore. It had become a matter of national pride, economic survival, and raw competition between rival empires, each one desperate to be the first to break a monopoly that had lasted for well over 1,000 years. For Portugal, Spain, and later the Dutch and the English, the search for cinnamon's true source would ultimately reshape the map of the entire known world, launching an age of exploration that changed the course of human history forever, one storm-battered voyage at a time. In 1505, Portuguese ships finally anchored off a lush, impossibly green coastline, unlike anything the crew had ever seen before in all their years at sea. the island that would soon become known throughout Europe simply as Ceylon. Under a wide canopy near the shoreline, a Portuguese captain sat, across from a local Sinhalese king, carefully negotiating a deal that traded firearms and military support in exchange for exclusive rights to the island's abundant, seemingly endless cinnamon groves. Deep within the humid, dense forest, local Ceylonese workers moved skillfully between young trees, peeling thin strips of bark by hand from tender new shoots, a delicate skill passed down carefully from parent to child across many generations, refined to near perfection long before any European ship ever arrived. Along the coast, Portuguese soldiers began construction on a heavily fortified stone outpost, cannons already positioned and aimed directly toward the harbor entrance below, a clear and unmistakable warning to any rival European power that might dare to challenge their new claim. Just outside nearby villages, freshly peeled cinnamon quills lay curled and drying on woven mats beneath the intense tropical sun, filling the surrounding air with a warm, unmistakable fragrance that carried for miles across the countryside. But peace between the two sides never truly lasted for very long. Negotiations between Portuguese officers and local island nobles collapsed again and again, dissolving repeatedly into raised voices, broken promises, and steadily mounting distrust on both sides of the negotiating table. Within just a few short decades, Portugal had transformed a peaceful tropical island into a heavily militarized trading outpost, extracting as much cinnamon as physically possible while local rulers watched their ancient trade quietly slip entirely out of their own hands, replaced by foreign soldiers and foreign profit. And though Portugal believed their control over Ceylon would last indefinitely, their grip on the island and its precious cinnamon was already far more fragile than anyone in Lisbon dared to imagine. Other European powers had been watching this entire arrangement from a distance, quietly taking notes, and it wouldn't be long before one of them decided that Portugal's monopoly was worth taking by force, whatever the cost and whatever violence it might ultimately require. In 1638, Dutch VOC soldiers stormed the Portuguese coastal fort under cover of complete darkness, muskets flashing violently against the night sky as decades of colonial rivalry finally erupted into open warfare. Once firmly in control of the island, a senior company officer signed a chilling official decree ordering the deliberate destruction of excess cinnamon trees across entire regions, a calculated move designed purely to keep prices high across every market in Europe. Deep in the sweltering forest, Sinhalese peelers were now forced to work under the constant watch of armed Dutch overseers, stripped almost entirely of the independence and relative freedom they had once maintained under the previous, less organized Portuguese administration. Back in Amsterdam, company clerks worked long hours inside crowded ledger rooms, carefully calculating record-breaking profits pouring in steadily from the newly secured Ceylon monopoly, numbers that shocked even seasoned Dutch merchants accustomed to enormous colonial wealth. Discipline on the plantations grew increasingly brutal under Dutch rule, enforced by overseers who answered to absolutely no one but the company itself, operating with almost total impunity across the entire occupied territory. And whenever company warehouses threatened to overflow with more cinnamon than the European market could realistically absorb, entire stockpiles were deliberately burned to the ground. A staggering waste justified purely by the relentless logic of maintaining artificially high prices. For nearly a century and a half, the Dutch East India Company treated an entire island, and everyone living on it, as nothing more than a single, highly profitable cinnamon producing machine, extracting wealth with ruthless, almost mechanical efficiency. Resistance did occur, though it was often crushed quickly and decisively. Local uprisings against Dutch control flared up periodically across the island, only to be met with overwhelming military force, a pattern that repeated itself again and again across multiple generations. And while the Dutch grew extraordinarily wealthy from this single spice, the people who actually cultivated, harvested, and processed it saw almost none of that fortune reach their own hands, a bitter imbalance that would eventually help shape the island's future, its politics, and its relationship with foreign powers for centuries to come. By 1796, British Royal Navy ships sailed confidently into Ceylon's harbor, as Dutch flags were lowered for the very last time. marking yet another dramatic shift in the ongoing struggle for control of the island's cinnamon trade. Under new British ownership, freshly planted cinnamon trees now stretched across the landscape in perfect, orderly rows extending toward the horizon, replacing the older, more scattered Dutch plantation system with something far more systematic and industrial. British plantation overseers moved methodically between rows, personally inspecting bundled cinnamon quills before they were approved for export, grading each batch carefully according to increasingly standardized quality measures. Down at the busy harbor, dock workers loaded massive shipments of processed cinnamon into the cargo holds of powerful steam-driven vessels, a scale of trade the older, slower sailing ships of previous centuries could never have realistically matched. On the crowded London trading floor, cinnamon futures were shouted loudly across a room packed with brokers in tall top hats, prices rising and falling within minutes based on rumors, shipping reports, and constantly shifting global demand. And for the very first time in centuries, cinnamon prices across Europe finally began a steady, sustained decline, as global supply slowly started catching up with an appetite that had once seemed completely insatiable. What had once been an impossibly rare luxury, guarded jealously by empires and fought over relentlessly for generations, was gradually becoming something almost ordinary people could realistically afford to purchase for themselves. This shift didn't happen overnight. It took decades of expanded cultivation, improved shipping routes, and growing competition from other cinnamon producing regions before prices finally settled into something resembling a normal, stable market. And yet, even as prices fell, Ceylon cinnamon retained a certain prestige, still considered by many connoisseurs across Europe to be the finest, most authentic version of the spice available anywhere in the entire world. Meanwhile, far to the east, another player was quietly entering the global market, one that would soon complicate the very definition of what real cinnamon actually meant, and blur a distinction most consumers today still don't fully understand. In the misty mountains of southern China, harvesters carefully stripped thick, fragrant bark from cassia trees, a close botanical cousin of true cinnamon that had been cultivated and traded across Asia for thousands of years, largely unknown to markets further west. In the bustling markets of Guangzhou, cassia bark sold openly alongside genuine Ceylon cinnamon, displayed on adjacent stalls, and remarkably few ordinary buyers could actually tell the meaningful difference between the two similar-looking spices. In quiet European laboratories, chemists began carefully comparing the two substances side by side, discovering that cassia contained significantly higher levels of a naturally occurring compound called coumarin, a finding with real implications for both flavor and long-term health. Across Indonesia, local farmers loaded sack after sack of freshly harvested cassia bark onto crowded river barges, feeding a rapidly growing global demand that showed absolutely no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Modern spice processing factories began blending cassia and true cinnamon together for mass market packaging, a practical decision that dramatically cut production costs while barely affecting the average consumer's overall experience of flavor. And today, in supermarkets scattered across nearly every country on Earth, most ordinary shoppers have genuinely no idea which type of cinnamon is actually sitting inside the jar they just placed into their cart. What began as two entirely separate spices, native to different regions with completely different histories, had slowly merged together in the public imagination into one single, largely undifferentiated product on the shelf. For centuries, Ceylon cinnamon had been the only version Europe ever knew, fought over, monopolized, and guarded jealously by empire after empire. Cassia changed everything simply by being cheaper, more abundant, and far easier to produce at massive scale. By the 20th century, the vast majority of cinnamon consumed across North America wasn't Ceylon cinnamon at all, but cassia, imported primarily from China, Vietnam, and Indonesia, at a fraction of the historical cost. Few consumers ever bothered to ask which variety they were actually buying, and fewer still realized that the two spices, though related, carried genuinely different flavor profiles, chemical compositions, and even different historical legacies, stretching back thousands of years across two entirely different continents. By the 20th century, massive industrial spice processing factories ground cinnamon bark by the ton on continuously running steel conveyor belts, a scale of production the ancient traders who once guarded this same spice could never have possibly imagined. In a typical 1950s American kitchen, cinnamon rolls baked slowly inside a modest oven, while steam gently fogged the window above the sink, filling the entire house with a warm, comforting scent that had once belonged exclusively to pharaohs and emperors. Today, a barista dusts ground cinnamon over the foam of a morning latte without giving it a second thought. An entirely automatic gesture repeated millions of times daily in coffee shops, scattered across virtually every corner of the modern world. At busy modern shipping ports, massive cargo containers sit stacked by the thousands in neat, orderly rows. One among them, simply labeled spices, carrying more cinnamon in a single container than entire ancient kingdoms once possessed collectively. Food scientists now routinely test cinnamon extract for potential use in everyday products, ranging from chewing gum and toothpaste to skincare formulas, exploring commercial applications far beyond anything early traders could have ever anticipated. And somewhere online, a teenager films yet another viral cinnamon challenge video, coughing and laughing for the camera, with absolutely no idea of the vast, bloody 3,000-year history behind the very spice now filling his mouth. What was once a substance so rare it justified wars, conquest, and empire, now sits quietly in nearly every kitchen on Earth, taken so completely for granted that its extraordinary history has been almost entirely forgotten by the very people who use it daily. Global cinnamon production today measures in the hundreds of thousands of tons annually, a staggering figure that would have seemed like pure fantasy to any trader operating just a few centuries ago, when a single shipment might have been guarded by armed soldiers. And yet, despite this massive scale, Sri Lanka's true Ceylon cinnamon still commands a noticeably higher price than mass-produced Cassia, a quiet echo of the same value distinction that shaped centuries of trade, conflict, and empire, long before modern industry, refrigeration, or global shipping ever existed to make any of this possible. On a quiet Sri Lankan farm today, a worker still peels cinnamon bark by hand, using techniques almost identical to those practiced on this very same island many centuries ago, long before any European ship ever appeared on the horizon. In a fine dining kitchen halfway around the world, a chef dusts a small amount of cinnamon over a dessert plate, treating it as just one ordinary ingredient among dozens, barely worth a second thought in the middle of a busy evening service. If you could somehow overlay every trade route from every century onto a single map, Egyptian caravans, Roman shipping lanes, Arab desert paths, Portuguese sailing routes, Dutch company vessels, they would all eventually converge on this one small island in the Indian Ocean. In a simple kitchen somewhere ordinary, a child watches quietly as a parent stirs cinnamon into a cup of warm milk before bedtime. A tiny, almost invisible ritual, carrying an enormous, largely invisible history behind it. Gold coins from ancient Rome, a weathered sailing ship, and a modern spice jar on a supermarket shelf. Three objects separated by thousands of years, yet connected by the very same story. And as the sun sets slowly over the Sri Lankan coastline, the waves continue rolling in exactly as they always have, entirely indifferent to the empires, the wars, and the countless fortunes that rose and fell over a single, humble stick of bark. This has been the history of cinnamon, the spice that quietly started a war for the entire world and somehow still ended up sitting forgotten in the back of your kitchen cabinet. Think about that the next time you reach for it. A single stick of bark that priests once weighed against gold, that companies protected with violence, and that empires fought over for centuries. It traveled through the hands of Egyptian traders, Greek physicians, Roman senators, Arab merchants, Portuguese soldiers, Dutch companies, and British planters, each one adding another chapter to a story most of us never think about at all. And now, it's yours, sitting quietly in your cabinet, waiting for you to use it, completely unaware of just how much history is packed inside that small, unassuming jar. If this changed the way you'll think about cinnamon the next time you see it, that's exactly the point. History isn't just about famous names and major battles. Sometimes it's hiding in the most ordinary corners of our everyday lives.